The laughter rippled through the Joint Forces Officers Club like thunder before a storm, and Chief Petty Officer Mason Crawford stood at its center, all 6 feet 4 inches of Navy SEAL arrogance wrapped in combat fatigues that couldn't contain his granite-hard frame. He watched the small woman pouring coffee with the kind of predatory amusement reserved for cats playing with mice, his scarred knuckles drumming against the mahogany bar as 30 of America's most elite operators watched the show unfold. "Hey there, coffee girl," Crawford called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that only comes from someone who's never been on the receiving end of true humiliation. "What's your rank? Lieutenant of lattes? Captain of cappuccinos?" Rachel Porter set down the coffee pot with deliberate precision, each movement measured and exact, as if the simple act of serving beverages required the same attention to detail as diffusing an explosive device. At 5 feet 5 inches, she looked almost childlike next to the towering Special Operations warriors, filling the officers' club at Fort Bragg. Her logistics uniform hung loose on her narrow shoulders, the fabric seeming to swallow her slight frame, while wisps of blonde hair escaped from her regulation bun, framing a face that belonged more in a library than a military installation. "Lieutenant, sir," she replied, her voice so soft that Crawford had to lean forward, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers, close enough that she could smell the mixture of gun oil and expensive cologne that seemed to follow Navy SEALs everywhere they went. "Lieutenant?" A massive ranger with arms like tree trunks barked out a laugh that made the glasses on the bar rattle. "What do? Count bullets in the supply closet? Make sure the real warriors have enough pens to fill out their paperwork?" The room erupted in masculine laughter, the sound bouncing off the wood-paneled walls adorned with photographs of fallen heroes and battle flags from forgotten wars. 30 pairs of eyes, belonging to men who had killed for their country and would do so again without hesitation, fixed on Rachel like wolves sizing up a lamb that had wandered too far from the flock. SEALs with tridents gleaming on their chests, Rangers with their distinctive tan berets tucked into their shoulders, Delta Force operators whose very presence in the room was supposed to be classified, all united in their assessment of this small woman who dared to wear the same uniform they had bled in. Crawford stepped closer, using his height advantage to force Rachel to crane her neck back to maintain eye contact, a power play as old as confrontation itself. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've never fired a real weapon, never jumped out of a perfectly good airplane, and certainly never seen what the inside of an enemy compound looks like at 0-30. He turned to his audience, playing to them like a comedian working a crowd. "This, gentlemen, is why our military is getting soft. They hand out commissions to anyone who can pass a written test and do the minimum physical requirements. Meanwhile, real operators like us have to carry the weight of actual combat operations." Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply held Crawford's gaze with an unsettling calm that should have been his first warning. Her green eyes, which had seemed almost doe-like moments before, held a depth that spoke of experiences the boastful SEAL couldn't begin to imagine. In the far corner of the room, 3 brigadier generals who had been discussing budget allocations over whiskey suddenly stopped their conversation, their attention drawn to the confrontation like iron filings to a magnet. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, each one seeming to echo in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the immediate area around them. Then Crawford laughed, a harsh sound that broke the spell. "Nothing to say for yourself, Lieutenant? That's probably for the best. Real soldiers do the talking with actions, not words." Master Sergeant Blake Anderson, a ranger with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak and arms thick as bridge cables, pushed off from the bar and joined the growing circle around Rachel. His boots, polished to a mirror shine that would have made any drill sergeant weep with joy, clicked against the hardwood floor as he approached. "Look at that stance," he said, gesturing at Rachel with his beer bottle, amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "She's standing there like a civilian at a bus stop, no military bearing whatsoever. I bet she couldn't even execute a proper parade rest if her life depended on it." Something flickered across Rachel's features, a micro-expression so brief that only someone trained in reading human behavior would have caught it. Without conscious thought, her feet shifted exactly 18 inches apart, her hands moved behind her back with her left hand gripping her right wrist, and her shoulders squared into perfect parade rest position. The transformation was so fluid, so automatic, that it took a moment for the observers to process what they had just witnessed. "Well, would you look at that," Anderson said. though his mocking tone had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that might have been the first stirring of curiosity. The lieutenant can follow basic instructions. Someone give her a medal. If you're watching this and feeling that burning sense of injustice, that's exactly what we need. Sometimes the most powerful warriors are the ones who never advertise their strength. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next few minutes will completely shatter every assumption about what real military power looks like. Trust me, you've never seen a reversal quite like this one. The crowd had grown now, drawn by that universal military instinct that says wherever operators are laughing, something worth watching is happening. Connor Hayes, a Delta Force operative whose actual presence at Fort Bragg was classified at a level most people in the room couldn't even access, stepped forward. Unlike Crawford's bulk or Anderson's raw physical presence, Hayes moved with the controlled precision of a surgeon, each gesture economical and purposeful. His eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, studied Rachel with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every detail for later analysis. "So, Lieutenant," Hayes said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that he could turn on and off like a switch, depending on what persona he needed to project. "Since you're wearing our uniform, you must know something about weapons. Tell me, what's the effective range of a Barrett .50 caliber rifle?" The question hung in the air like a challenge coin, waiting to be slapped down on the bar. Every operator in the room knew the answer, had probably fired the massive anti-materiel rifle dozens of times in training and combat. They waited for Rachel to fumble, to give some vague response that would confirm their assumptions about her being nothing more than a paper-pushing pretender playing soldier. Rachel's response came without hesitation, delivered in that same quiet voice that somehow managed to cut through the ambient noise of the club. Effective range is 1,800 meters for point targets, 2,400 meters for area targets. The M107 variant has a maximum effective range of 2,000 meters with match-grade ammunition. Muzzle velocity is 853 meters per second with standard M33 rounds. The laughter died like someone had thrown a switch. Hayes' eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, and even Crawford looked momentarily nonplussed. But recovery came quickly, as it always did with men trained to adapt to changing tactical situations. "Wikipedia knowledge," Crawford scoffed, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Anyone can memorize specifications. That doesn't mean you know which end the bullet comes out of." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his SEAL Team 6 challenge coin, the metallic surface catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. With a casual flick of his wrist that spoke of countless hours of practice, he sent the coin spinning through the air toward Rachel, deliberately throwing it wide and high to force her to scramble for it. Rachel's hand moved with the kind of speed that comes not from conscious thought, but from muscle memory burned into the nervous system through thousands of repetitions. She plucked the coin from the air with a casual backhand catch that would have been impressive for a professional athlete, let alone a supposed desk jockey. The movement was so smooth, so effortless, that several of the watching operators unconsciously straightened their postures. Lieutenant Hazel Mitchell, one of only 3 women in the entire club, and the only other one in uniform, had been watching from her table near the windows. She rose and approached the group, her expression carefully neutral, but her body language suggesting someone preparing to intervene in a situation heading toward an ugly conclusion. Mitchell was intelligence corps, trained to read situations and people, and something about this scenario was setting off every instinct she had developed over 6 years of service. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from knowing secrets about everyone in the room, "perhaps we should let Lieutenant Porter get back to her duties. I'm sure she has more important things to do than entertain your need to prove your masculinity." Crawford turned his attention to Mitchell, and his smile became predatory in an entirely different way. Well, the intel officer wants to protect the supply clerk. How touching. Tell me, Mitchell, do you two have special meetings where you discuss how unfair it is that the big bad operators don't take you seriously?" "That's enough, Crawford," Mitchell said, but Rachel raised a hand, the gesture so subtle it might have been missed if everyone wasn't watching her so intently. "It's all right, Lieutenant Mitchell," Rachel said, and there was something in her tone, a quality that made the words sound less like acceptance of abuse and more like a decision being made. "Chief Crawford seems to believe that physical capability determines someone's worth to the military. Perhaps he'd like to set some parameters for that assessment." Crawford's grin widened, showing teeth that had been expensively repaired after too many bar fights and foreign ports. Oh, the little lieutenant wants to play? All right then. 20 push-ups, right here, right now. Show us that you can at least meet the minimum standard for a real soldier. Without a word, Rachel set down the coffee pot she had been holding and dropped to the floor with a fluidity that spoke of countless repetitions. Her form was textbook perfect, back straight as a rifle barrel, elbows bending to exactly 90 degrees, each repetition identical to the last. But it wasn't just the form that caught attention, it was the breathing, or rather the lack of it. While most people would be showing some sign of exertion by repetition 15, Rachel's breathing remained as steady as if she were taking a casual stroll through a park. She completed 20 push-ups and kept going. 25, 30, 35. At 40 she stopped, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She rose to her feet with the same fluid grace she had shown dropping down, and there wasn't even a hint of perspiration on her forehead. The room had gone completely silent. Even the bartender had stopped polishing glasses to watch. In the corner, General Martha Williams, a woman who had risen through the ranks when female officers were as rare as unicorns and twice as mystical, set down her whiskey and leaned forward with interest. Her companions, Generals Patricia Hayes and Anna Thompson, followed her gaze with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for battlefield intelligence briefings. "Neat party trick," Anderson said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier mockery. "But push-ups don't win wars. Tactical knowledge does. Tell me, Lieutenant, what would you do if your unit was pinned down in the Korengal Valley with enemy positions on 3 sides and no air support available?" The question was specific, pulled from Anderson's own experience in one of Afghanistan's deadliest valleys. It was the kind of scenario that had no textbook answer, requiring the sort of intuitive understanding of combat that only came from lived experience. He fully expected Rachel to fumble, to give some by-the-book response that would reveal her as the fraud he believed her to be. Military-grade smartphones have become essential for today's service members, Rachel thought absently, as she noticed Hayes pulling out what was clearly a specialized device, probably running encrypted communications software that would make civilian phones look like toys from the Stone Age. These devices featured encrypted communication channels, satellite connectivity even in remote locations, and durability that withstands extreme conditions. With specialized apps for tactical planning and secure messaging, these phones cost significantly more than civilian models, but provided the security and reliability that military personnel required in the field. "The Korengal scenario," Rachel said, her voice taking on a different quality, as if she were seeing something beyond the wood-paneled walls of the officers' club. Standard doctrine would suggest attempting to break contact and withdraw to a defensive position. But in the Korengal, with its steep walls and limited egress routes, that's a death sentence. The only viable option is to identify the enemy's command element, usually positioned at the highest elevation point for maximum oversight, and neutralize it with precise fire to disrupt their coordination. Then you use smoke to obscure movement, while one fire team provides suppressive fire at alternating intervals, creating gaps in the enemy's response pattern. You exploit those gaps to establish a flanking position on the eastern ridge, where the terrain creates a natural defilade from the primary enemy positions. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried something that made several combat veterans in the room unconsciously lean forward. "Of course, this assumes you don't have a ghost unit available for emergency extraction. But then, most people don't even know those exist." The words hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Hayes's fingers had frozen over his phone screen, and Anderson's beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. Crawford, however, wasn't ready to concede anything. "Ghost units," he scoffed, though there was a slight uncertainty in his voice. "You're talking about urban legends, Lieutenant. Next you'll be telling us about secret bases under Denver Airport and aliens at Area 51. Rachel shrugged, the gesture casual but somehow carrying weight. "Of course, just stories, like the one about a classified unit that extracted a SEAL team from Fallujah in 2009 when they were surrounded by 300 insurgents, or the tale of a female commander who led an operation so classified that even mentioning its code name requires presidential approval. All just stories." Hayes had been typing rapidly on his phone, and suddenly his face went pale. He showed the screen to Anderson, who squinted at it and then looked at Rachel with an expression that had shifted from mockery to something approaching concern. Whatever database Hayes had accessed, whatever information he had tried to pull up about Rachel Porter, had returned a result neither man had expected. "What is it?" Crawford demanded, trying to see the screen. It says classified, Hayes replied slowly. Level 5 classification. I don't even have level 5 clearance. Nobody below Joint Chiefs has level 5 clearance. Crawford snatched the phone, staring at the screen as if he could intimidate it into revealing its secrets. That's impossible. She's a lieutenant in logistics. There's no way. He was interrupted by a distinctive sound that every military person in the room recognized, the sharp click of heels coming to attention. General Martha Williams had risen from her table and was walking toward them, her companions flanking her in a formation that suggested this was not a casual approach. Williams had served for 35 years, had commanded battalions in Iraq and Afghanistan, had medals and ribbons that told stories of courage under fire that most people could only imagine. When she moved through a room, even hardened operators paid attention. Chief Petty Officer Crawford, Williams said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command. I believe you were just about to apologize to Lieutenant Porter for your unprofessional behavior. Crawford's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables under tension. With all due respect, General, I don't see what I have to apologize for. If someone wears the uniform, they should be able to... Crawford, Williams cut him off with surgical precision. You're about to dig yourself a hole so deep that even your SEAL training won't help you climb out of it. I strongly suggest you stop talking. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the officers' club floor. Rachel remained still, her posture relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring that appeared at rest but contained tremendous potential energy. She hadn't asked for Williams's intervention, hadn't even looked at the general. Her focus remained on Crawford, those green eyes holding something that made the battle-hardened SEAL shift his weight unconsciously. Still think you know where this is heading? You're not even close. The breadcrumbs are adding up to something extraordinary. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now before the big reveal. This story is about to take a turn that nobody in that room saw coming. You know what I think? Crawford said, doubling down on his position with the kind of stubbornness that had probably kept him alive in hostile territories, but was about to become his biggest liability. I think we've got a case of stolen valor here. Someone who's memorized enough facts to sound legitimate, but has never actually been in the field. Tell me, Lieutenant Porter, have you ever actually been in combat? Have you ever had to make a life or death decision with incomplete information while people are actively trying to kill you? The question hung in the air like a challenge flag thrown down in medieval times. Several of the operators nodded, clearly agreeing with Crawford's assessment. After all, they had all been through the crucible of combat, had earned their positions through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. What could this small, quiet woman possibly know about that world? Rachel's hand moved to her collar, adjusting it slightly, and for just a moment, those with sharp eyes caught a glimpse of something at her collarbone. A scar, perhaps? Or was it something else? The movement was so quick, so subtle, that most dismissed it as nervous fidgeting, but General Williams saw it, and her eyes narrowed with sudden recognition. You want to know about combat decisions? Rachel said, and for the first time there was an edge to her voice, sharp as a K-bar knife. How about deciding which of your team members to save when you can only carry one? How about calling in an airstrike on your own position because it's the only way to prevent classified technology from falling into enemy hands? How about maintaining your cover while watching good people die because breaking it would compromise a mission that could save thousands? She stepped closer to Crawford, and despite the foot of height difference between them, something in her bearing made it seem like she was looking down at him. You ask if I've been in combat, Chief? The better question would be whether I've ever been out of it. Anderson set down his beer with a thunk that echoed in the now silent club. Lady, you're talking like you're some kind of special operator, but women weren't even allowed in combat roles until 2013 officially, Rachel finished. But official and actual are two very different things, Sergeant. There have always been operations that required capabilities beyond traditional military structures. Operations that needed people who could be invisible, who could go places that a 6'4" Navy SEAL could never access, who could eliminate targets without anyone ever knowing they were there. Crawford's patience finally snapped. He reached out and grabbed Rachel's shoulder, intending to spin her around and force her to face him directly. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The moment his hand made contact, several things happened simultaneously. Rachel's body moved with a fluidity that spoke of years of close-quarters combat training. Her hand came up, not to strike, but to redirect, using Crawford's own momentum against him in a move that looked almost like a dance step. At the same time, the force of his grab caused her uniform collar to tear slightly, revealing more of what lay beneath. General Williams's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "Chief, release her immediately. That's a direct order." Crawford, off balance from Rachel's subtle redirection, stumbled back a step. His hand released her shoulder, but the damage was done. The torn collar had revealed just enough for those who knew what to look for, to see the edge of something that shouldn't exist. "My God," someone whispered from the crowd that had gathered. It might have been Lieutenant Mitchell, or perhaps one of the other officers who had joined the spectacle. "Is that—" Hayes's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He looked at it, and his face went from pale to absolutely white. He showed it to Anderson, who read it, and immediately took a step back from Rachel. The message, from someone very high in the command structure, contained only a few words, but they changed everything. "Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Ghost. 7 protocols active." But Crawford, running on adrenaline and wounded pride, wasn't paying attention to the warning signs that were rapidly accumulating around him. "Stolen valor," he said, his voice rising. "That's what this is. Some desk jockey who thinks she can wear unauthorized insignia and claim to be something she's not. I've seen it before. People who want the respect without earning it, who want the glory without the sacrifice. Veterans' life insurance policies offer unique benefits tailored to military service members and their families," Rachel noticed absently as she saw an insurance advertisement on the wall, reminding members about benefit updates. These specialized plans accounted for deployment risks, provided coverage regardless of location, and included clauses for combat-related incidents. Premium rates varied based on service branch and deployment history, but the comprehensive coverage ensured families were protected no matter where duty called. The 3 generals had closed the distance now, forming a loose semicircle that seemed to shift the very gravity of the room. Williams looked at Crawford with an expression that could have frozen helium. "Chief Petty Officer Crawford, you are 1 sentence away from ending your career. I suggest you choose your next words very, very carefully." But it was too late for careful words. Crawford had committed to his course of action, driven by the kind of toxic pride that had destroyed more military careers than enemy bullets ever had. "With all due respect, General, I know stolen valor when I see it. This woman is pretending to be something she's not, and I'm going to prove it." He reached out again, this time grabbing the torn portion of Rachel's collar with the intention of ripping it further, of exposing whatever she was hiding beneath. The fabric gave way with a sound like tearing paper, and suddenly, everything in the room changed. The torn uniform revealed a tattoo on Rachel's left shoulder. But this wasn't some decorative piece of body art that someone might get on liberty in a foreign port. This was something else entirely. A skull, rendered in stark black ink with a precision that suggested military documentation rather than artistic expression, stared out at the room. Below it, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the retinas of everyone who saw them, were the words Ghost 7, and beneath that, 3 numbers. 1. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs in nature just before a devastating storm, when even the insects stop their chittering, and the air itself seems to hold its breath. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody even blinked. Then Lieutenant Mitchell gasped, a sharp intake of breath that shattered the stillness like a hammer through glass. "Oh my God," she said, and her words seemed to release everyone else from their paralysis. General Williams, General Patricia Hayes, and General Anna Thompson moved as one, their bodies snapping to attention with a precision that would have made drill instructors weep with joy. 3 of the highest-ranking officers at Fort Bragg, women who had fought their way through decades of institutional resistance to reach their positions, stood at perfect attention, facing a lieutenant in a torn logistics uniform. Crawford's hand fell away from Rachel's collar, as if the fabric had suddenly become radioactive. His face, which had been flushed with righteous anger, drained of color so quickly that he looked like he might faint. Behind him, Anderson's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sound like breaking bones. The brown liquid spread across the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. That's impossible," Anderson stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ghost Unit doesn't exist. It's a myth, a story they tell at Special Operations Selection to motivate candidates. Hayes's laptop, which he had been using to run deeper background checks, suddenly displayed a screen that made him physically recoil. Where before it had shown classified, level 5, now it showed something that shouldn't have been possible. Commander Rachel Porter, classification beyond top secret, Ghost 7 actual, authorization, presidential eyes only. We're seconds away from one of the most shocking military revelations you'll ever witness. The tension in that room is about to explode. Make sure you're subscribed because after this moment, nothing will ever be the same for these elite operators. General Martha Williams took a step forward, her bearing perfect despite her age. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the silent club with crystal clarity. Commander Porter, we weren't expecting you here. I apologize for the behavior of these men. She raised her right hand to her forehead in a salute so crisp it could have been used in training videos. Generals Patricia Hayes and Anna Thompson followed suit immediately, 3 of the most powerful women in the United States military, rendering honors to someone who, moments before, had been serving coffee and enduring mockery. Rachel returned the salute with equal precision, and when her hand dropped, she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of command experience that Crawford could only dream of. Generals, I appreciate the gesture, but it's unnecessary. I'm here unofficially. Williams lowered her hand, but her posture remained formal. Unofficial or not, Commander, respect is due, especially after Syria. The word Syria seemed to trigger something in the room. Several of the special operators exchanged glances, remembering classified operations in that country that had gone sideways, missions that should have ended in disaster, but somehow hadn't. Stories they had heard but never quite believed about a unit that appeared out of nowhere to extract teams that were beyond salvation. You were in Syria? Hayes asked, his voice barely steady. You were part of Operation Blackwater? Williams turned to face the room, her expression carved from granite. She wasn't part of it. She led it. Ghost 7 saved my entire battalion when we were surrounded outside Damascus. 300 enemy fighters, no air support, and ammunition running critically low. We had resigned ourselves to making our last stand when her unit appeared. 8 operators who moved through enemy positions like they weren't even there. They eliminated the enemy command structure, created an extraction corridor, and got all 200 of my people out without losing a single soldier. She paused, letting the words sink in. The official report lists it as a successful tactical withdrawal supported by local allied forces. The truth is that Ghost 7 saved us all, and Commander Porter personally eliminated 17 enemy combatants while providing covering fire for our wounded. Crawford's legs seemed to have forgotten how to support his weight. He sank into a nearby chair, his face a study in shock and growing horror at what he had done. The challenge coin he had thrown so casually earlier lay on the floor between them, and the sight of it seemed to drive home the magnitude of his miscalculation. General Hayes stepped forward, reaching into her pocket to withdraw her own challenge coin. But this wasn't just any coin. The serial number on it was familiar to anyone who had studied Special Operations history. 0001, the first Ghost Unit coin ever minted, given only to those who had served in operations, so classified that their very existence was denied at the highest levels of government. Commander Porter, Hayes said, offering the coin with both hands in a gesture of profound respect. I believe you might recognize this. You gave it to me in Kandahar after your unit saved my convoy from an ambush that intelligence had missed. 43 enemy fighters eliminated in 6 minutes. I never got to thank you properly. Rachel looked at Detsoa's coin but didn't take it. Keep it, General. You earned it by surviving. That's all the thanks necessary. Anderson had backed up against the bar, his large frame somehow seeming smaller than it had before. But women weren't... Ghost units are Tier 1, beyond Tier 1. The selection process alone has a 98% failure rate for men. How did you... By being better, Rachel said simply. By being someone who could infiltrate places where a 6'4" American man would stand out like a searchlight. By having skills that went beyond physical strength. By understanding that sometimes the best warrior is the one nobody sees coming. She turned to Crawford, who looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. You asked about combat experience, Chief. I've been in operations you don't have clearance to know about, in countries we're not supposed to be in, eliminating threats that officially don't exist. I've made decisions that kept America safe, while people like you were sleeping soundly in your beds, never knowing how close you came to waking up in a very different world. Online tactical leadership courses designed for military officers are revolutionizing professional development, Rachel observed, noticing a poster about command development programs on the wall. These programs, often costing thousands of dollars, provided advanced strategic training, crisis management skills, and classified tactics education. Accredited by military institutions, they allowed officers to enhance their qualifications while maintaining active duty schedules. The afternoon sun was lower now, casting golden light through the windows and creating long shadows across the floor. The officers' club, which had been filled with laughter and mockery just minutes before, now felt like a church where something sacred and terrible had been revealed. Crawford finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. How could I know? You were serving coffee. I was doing what I've always done, Rachel interrupted. Blending in, being invisible, being underestimated. It's not a weakness, Chief. It's a tactical advantage that you'll never have. General Thompson, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Commander Porter, might I ask why you're here? Ghost 7 doesn't deploy domestically without presidential authorization. Rachel's expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression that suggested she was weighing how much to reveal. I'm in transition, she said carefully. Between operations. Sometimes it's necessary to disappear completely, to become someone so ordinary that even trained observers don't give you a second glance. And we interrupted that, Williams said, her tone carrying genuine regret, by forcing you to reveal yourself. It was inevitable, Rachel replied. Covers don't last forever. And honestly, watching Chief Crawford's face go through the entire spectrum of human emotion in 30 seconds was almost worth it. Despite the tension, a few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. The attempt at humor seemed to break some of the spell that had fallen over the room, allowing people to breathe again, though the atmosphere remained charged with the kind of energy that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. Lieutenant Mitchell approached slowly, her intelligence training making her cautious even in this moment of revelation. Commander, the things you've seen, the operations you've been part of, how do you process it all? How do you go from that world to this one? Rachel considered the question, her hand unconsciously moving to adjust her torn collar, revealing more of the tattoo that had changed everything. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn that the person who eliminates threats in hostile territory and the person who serves coffee in an officer's club are both real, both necessary. You learn that sometimes the greatest strength is in choosing not to use it. Crawford stood slowly, his movements careful, as if he were afraid sudden motion might trigger some kind of response. He reached down and picked up his challenge coin from the floor, holding it for a moment before extending it toward Rachel. Commander, I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you a debt I can never repay. My team, SEAL Team 6, we were in Fallujah in 2009. The operation that went sideways, where we were surrounded and out of ammunition, that was us. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. The revelation sent another shockwave through the room. Crawford, the arrogant SEAL who had started this entire confrontation, had been saved by the very woman he had been mocking. The irony was so perfect it seemed almost scripted, but the pain in Crawford's eyes was absolutely real. If this story gave you chills, wait until you see what we have coming next. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because tomorrow's story involves a female Apache pilot who made an entire battalion salute. You won't want to miss it. Rachel looked at the coin in Crawford's extended hand but didn't take it. Keep your coin, Chief. You earned it in Fallujah. What you can do is learn from this. The next time you see someone who doesn't fit your image of what a warrior should look like, remember this moment. Remember that strength comes in many forms, and the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you'd least suspect. The sound of a secure phone ringing cut through the moment like a blade. Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out a device that looked like a standard smartphone, but had modifications that suggested capabilities far beyond civilian technology. She looked at the screen, and her expression shifted from casual to intensely focused in an instant. Yes, she said simply, then listened for several seconds. Her face revealed nothing, but those watching closely could see her posture shift subtly, moving from relaxed to ready. Understood. I'm on my way. She ended the call and looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who would never look at the world quite the same way again. "Generals, gentlemen, it's been educational, but I have to go." Williams stepped forward. "Another operation?" "Something like that," Rachel replied, already moving toward the door with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested urgency without panic. But then she stopped, turning back to face Crawford one more time. "Chief, you asked if I'd ever been in combat. The truth is, I've never been out of it. Every day, in every place, there are threats that ordinary people never see, dangers they never know existed, because people like me make sure they never have to. That's not a burden or a curse, it's a privilege. Remember that the next time you think you know what a warrior looks like." The door to the officers' club swung shut behind Rachel Porter, with a finality that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The 30 elite operators who had just witnessed the most spectacular reversal of their military careers stood frozen like statues in a museum dedicated to shattered assumptions. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Crawford's legs gave out and he sank into the nearest chair, his face the color of week-old ash. "Holy cow," someone whispered from the back of the room, the words barely audible but somehow capturing what everyone was thinking. We just insulted a ghost unit commander." General Martha Williams stepped forward from where she had rendered her salute, her bearing still military perfect despite her 70 years. She looked at Crawford with an expression that could have frozen hellfire. "Chief Petty Officer Crawford, Master Sergeant Anderson, Operator Hayes, my office, now." The 3 men followed the generals like condemned prisoners walking to their execution, leaving behind a room full of operators who immediately erupted into hushed, frantic conversations. Lieutenant Hazel Mitchell pulled out her secure phone, her intelligence training kicking in as she began documenting everything she had witnessed. This wasn't just a story. This was a fundamental shift in military history happening in real time. In the commandeered private dining room that Williams had claimed as her temporary office, the 3 generals positioned themselves behind a mahogany table that had probably cost more than most soldiers made in a year. The wood was polished to a mirror shine, and Crawford could see his own devastated reflection, staring back at him as he stood at attention with Anderson and Hayes flanking him. "Gentlemen," General Patricia Hayes began, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested volcanic emotions held in check by decades of military discipline. "Do you have any conception of what you've just done? Any idea of the security breach you've created?" Anderson opened his mouth to respond, but Williams cut him off with a gesture sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't speak. Not yet. First, you're going to listen to exactly what kind of disaster you've created, and then you're going to explain to me how 3 of America's supposedly elite operators managed to compromise one of our most classified assets through sheer arrogance and stupidity." General Anna Thompson stood and moved to a locked briefcase that had been sitting unnoticed in the corner. She input a complex code, submitted to a biometric scan, and withdrew a tablet that looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. When she activated it, the screen displayed classification markings that none of the 3 men had ever seen before. "What I'm about to show you doesn't officially exist," Thompson said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the room's soundproofing. "If any of you breathe a word of this outside this room, you'll disappear so thoroughly that your own mothers will forget you were ever born." The tablet's screen shifted to display a series of operational photos, each one showing missions and locations that made the 3 men lean forward involuntarily. The images were partially redacted, faces obscured, but the contexts were clear. Operations in territories where American forces absolutely were not supposed to be. "Tehran, 2015, Thompson narrated, swiping to the next image. A nuclear scientist was about to sell weapons-grade uranium to terrorists. Ghost 7 infiltrated a facility that was supposed to be impenetrable, eliminated 17 Revolutionary Guards, and extracted the scientist in under an hour. The operation prevented a nuclear device from being detonated in Tel Aviv." Another swipe. "North Korea, 2017. 3 CIA operatives had been captured and were being tortured for information that would have compromised every American intelligence asset in Asia. Ghost 7 went in with no backup, no support, and no official authorization. They got our people out and destroyed intelligence that would have cost hundreds of American lives." Image after image revealed operations that sounded like movie plots, but were documented with the kind of detail that proved their reality. Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Russia, China, places where a single American military bootprint could start World War III. And the person leading every one of these operations, Williams said, taking over the narrative, was the woman you just physically assaulted and publicly humiliated, the woman you called weak, the woman you said was everything wrong with the military. Crawford's hands were shaking now, the tremor starting in his fingers and working its way up his arms. General, we didn't. How could we possibly know? That's exactly the point, Williams snapped. You couldn't know. Ghost unit operators are so classified that their existence is denied at every level of government below the president. They have no official records, no public recognition, no acknowledgement that they even exist. They operate in the spaces between what's legal and what's necessary, doing the jobs that keep America safe while people like you sleep soundly in your beds. Hayes, whose laptop still displayed the Beyond Top Secret warning, asked quietly, "Why was she here? Serving coffee?" Thompson's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained stern. "Recovery. Even ghost operators need downtime. Porter has been using Fort Bragg as a safe house between operations for the past 3 months, hiding in plain sight. It's the perfect cover. Who's going to suspect a logistics lieutenant serving coffee of being one of America's most lethal warriors?" "And we destroyed that cover," Anderson said, the full implications finally hitting him like a freight train. "We've compromised her ability to operate. We've potentially put ongoing operations at risk." "Worse than that," Williams said, pulling up another file on the tablet. "Porter is currently the handler for 3 deep cover assets in hostile territory. If her identity is compromised, if the wrong people connect the woman in those viral videos to Ghost 7, those assets die, slowly, painfully, and the intelligence networks they've spent years building collapse overnight." The weight of their actions settled on the 3 men like a physical burden. Crawford looked like he might vomit, his SEAL training the only thing keeping him upright. What happens now?" Williams stood, moving around the table to stand directly in front of Crawford. Despite the height difference, she seemed to tower over him. "Now you face consequences. Crawford, you are suspended from active duty effective immediately. Your security clearance is under review. You may be looking at a discharge that will make you unemployable in any field requiring a background check." She turned to Anderson. "You're being transferred to a training battalion in Missouri. For the next year, you'll be teaching recruits about respect, humility, and the dangers of making assumptions. Your Ranger tab is provisional, pending successful completion of this assignment." Finally, she faced Hayes. "Your Delta status is revoked. You're being returned to regular Army intelligence, where you'll spend your time writing reports about threats you'll never be allowed to engage, because you've proven you can't be trusted with operational security." The sentences hit like physical blows. These weren't just career setbacks. They were professional death sentences. Crawford's legs finally gave out completely, and he sank into a chair without permission, his face in his hands. "General," he said, his voice muffled by his palms, "in Fallujah, 2009, my team was surrounded, 24 of us, out of ammunition, writing goodbye letters in our heads. Then someone started taking out insurgents from impossible angles, perfect shots from distances that shouldn't have been possible. We thought it was a miracle." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "It was her, wasn't it? Porter saved my life, saved all our lives, and you just physically assaulted and publicly humiliated the person who kept you alive," Williams finished coldly. "Yes, Chief, that's exactly what you did." Meanwhile, back in the main area of the officers' club, the atmosphere had transformed from a social gathering to something resembling a wake. Operators who had laughed at Rachel's expense now sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. Several were on their phones, trying to find any information about ghost units, finding only heavily redacted documents and congressional testimony that danced around the truth. Lieutenant Mitchell had taken position behind the bar, not serving, but standing guard over the spot where history had been revealed. She pulled out her secure laptop and began accessing intelligence databases, looking for patterns she might have missed. "I should have known," she muttered to herself, fingers flying across the keyboard. The way she moved, the way she observed everything while seeming to see nothing. Those aren't logistics skills, those are predator instincts. A young Marine captain approached her, his face troubled. Lieutenant, is it true what they're saying, that Porter has been running operations we don't even have clearance to know about? Mitchell looked up from her screen. Captain, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. I've been tracking anomalies in operational reports for the past 2 years. Missions that succeeded when they should have failed. Enemy commanders eliminated by forces that didn't officially exist. Hostages rescued from locations that were supposed to be unreachable. There's been a pattern, and now it has a name. Ghost 7. An Air Force combat controller who had been sitting quietly in the corner stood up, his movement drawing attention. I was in Syria in 2018, he said slowly, as if pulling up painful memories. My unit was overrun. 12 of us, surrounded by over 100 hostiles. We were down to our last magazines when this force appeared out of nowhere. 8 operators moving through enemy positions like they weren't even there. One of them was smaller than the rest, moved differently, like water flowing around rocks. He paused, taking a long drink from his whiskey. That operator took 3 bullets providing cover while we extracted, never even slowed down. Just kept laying down suppressive fire with precision I've never seen before or since. We never found out who they were. Command just told us it never happened. It was her, Mitchell said quietly. Porter and Ghost 7. They saved you. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes. The 3 men looked like they had aged a decade in 30 minutes. Crawford still clutched his challenge coin, but now it looked less like a badge of honor and more like evidence of his shame. The room fell silent as Crawford approached the spot where the confrontation had occurred. He looked at the coffee stain on the floor, at the torn fabric from Rachel's uniform, and his shoulders shook with what might have been suppressed sobs. I need to say something, Crawford announced, his voice barely steady. What happened here today was my fault. My arrogance, my assumptions, my toxic masculinity led to one of America's greatest warriors being compromised. I dishonored the uniform I wear and the oath I took. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow operators. We talk about brotherhood, about leaving no one behind, about honor and courage, but today we showed that those are just words when they're not backed by actual respect for everyone who serves. We failed. I failed. And that failure might have cost lives. Anderson stepped forward, adding his voice. Porter has been saving our lives for years, and we didn't even know she existed. She's been operating in the shadows, taking risks we can't even imagine, all while people like us dismissed her as weak because of how she looks. We're everything wrong with military culture concentrated into one shameful display. Hayes pulled up something on his phone and projected it onto the wall-mounted screen usually used for sporting events. It was a partially declassified after-action report, heavily redacted, but with enough visible to understand the significance. This is from an operation in Afghanistan, 2016, he said. A forward operating base was about to be overrun. 43 Americans against 300 Taliban fighters. The report says they were saved by providential intervention. But look at this. He zoomed in on a section that had been poorly redacted. Through the black bars, fragments of text were visible. Female operator, 800-meter shots, 17 hours of continuous engagement, refused extraction until all friendlies secure. Porter spent 17 hours on an exposed ridge in below freezing temperatures, picking off anyone who tried to advance on that FOB, Hayes said. She stayed even after she'd been spotted, even after taking return fire, even after command ordered her to withdraw. 43 families didn't get folded flags because she refused to leave. The weight of these revelations was crushing. Several operators had tears running down their faces, the kind of emotional display that would normally result in mockery, but now seemed entirely appropriate. Lieutenant Willow Adams, one of the youngest officers present, stood up. We need to talk about what this means for all of us. How many other Rachel Porters have we driven away? How many capable warriors have we dismissed because they didn't look like us? How much talent have we wasted because of our prejudices? The question hung in the air, its implications reshaping everything they thought that they knew about military service. The traditional image of the warrior, large, male, physically imposing, was revealed as just one option among many, and perhaps not even the most effective for many missions. The base commander, Colonel James Mitchell, arrived at 2100 hours, his presence immediately commanding attention. Mitchell was a man who had earned his position through competence rather than politics, and his expression suggested he was deeply troubled by what had occurred. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the room, what happened here today will have repercussions far beyond this base. I've just been informed that SEAL Team 6 has been suspended from operational status pending a complete review of unit culture and leadership. Rangers and Delta Force are facing similar reviews. The Secretary of Defense is personally involved. The news hit like a bomb. SEAL Team 6, the unit that had killed bin Laden, suspended because of what had happened in this room. The magnitude of the consequences was staggering. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, Commander Porter has agreed to lead a comprehensive review of Special Operations culture and selection criteria. The woman you mocked will now be reshaping the entire structure of elite military units. The irony is not lost on anyone. Crawford stood slowly, squaring his shoulders. Colonel, I'd like to volunteer to assist with that review. Not in a leadership role, but as an example of what needs to change. My behavior, my assumptions, they're symptoms of a disease that's infected our entire culture. If my failure can help others learn, then maybe something good can come from this disgrace. Mitchell studied him for a long moment. I'll pass along your offer, Chief, though your suspension remains in effect regardless. As the evening progressed, the Officers' Club transformed from a social venue to something resembling a therapy session. Operators who had never questioned their assumptions found themselves examining beliefs they'd held since basic training. The story of Rachel Porter spread through military networks at the speed of light, becoming legend before the sun had set. Online tactical leadership courses designed for military officers are revolutionizing professional development, one poster on the wall proclaimed, seeming almost prophetic now. These programs, often costing thousands of dollars, provided advanced strategic training that Porter had mastered not in classrooms, but in the field, under fire, making decisions that determined whether Americans lived or died. Master Sergeant Flynn Cooper, Crawford's teammate, entered carrying a tablet. What he showed Crawford made the SEAL's face go even paler. It's from Naval Special Warfare Command, Cooper said quietly. They want all of us to report for remedial training on respect, equality, and operational security. 6 weeks minimum. Our deployment schedule has been canceled. The implications were staggering. Missions that SEAL Team 6 was supposed to conduct would have to be reassigned or canceled. Operations months in planning would have to be scrapped. All because of what had happened in this room. This is bigger than just us, Crawford said, his voice hollow. This is going to change everything. Selection, training, evaluation criteria. Porter hasn't just exposed our prejudices. She's exposed fundamental flaws in how we think about warfare itself. 3 days passed in a blur of investigations, interviews, and inquiries. The video that Captain Amber Rodriguez had recorded before security confiscated her phone had somehow leaked, and within 72 hours, it had been viewed over 10 million times. The image of 3 brigadier generals saluting a woman in a torn logistics uniform became iconic, shared across social media with captions about hidden strength and the dangers of assumptions. Rachel Porter, meanwhile, had seemingly vanished. Some said she'd been reassigned to an even more classified position. Others whispered she was already on another mission, once again invisible, once again saving lives from the shadows. But her impact remained, rippling through the military like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The base held an unprecedented all-hands meeting in the main auditorium. Every Special Operations member who could attend was required to be there. General Williams stood at the podium, her presence commanding absolute attention from the 1,000 warriors packed into the space. 3 days ago, she began, we witnessed something that should never have happened. A genuine American hero was forced to reveal herself because of prejudice, arrogance, and toxic behavior that we've allowed to fester in our ranks for too long. She paused, letting her words sink in. But more than that, we discovered that our assumptions about what makes an effective warrior are fundamentally flawed. While we've been selecting for size and strength, the enemy has been adapting. They've been learning our patterns, our tactics, our limitations, and the only thing that's kept us ahead is operators like Commander Porter, who don't fit our traditional model, but who possess capabilities we desperately need. The lights dimmed, and a presentation began on the screen behind her. It showed statistics that made the audience shift uncomfortably. Missions that required infiltration rather than assault. Operations where cultural invisibility mattered more than firepower. Situations where being underestimated was the greatest tactical advantage. 53% of our mission failures in the last 5 years have been because we couldn't get close enough to the target, Williams continued. Because a 6'4" American man with shoulders like a linebacker stands out in a crowd of 5'6" locals. Because our operators are too visible, too obvious, too limited by their very physical presence. She clicked to the next slide, showing a silhouette with a question mark. Ghost units have a 100% success rate, 100%. Not because they're stronger or better armed, but because they can become invisible. Because they recruit operators the enemy doesn't expect. Because they understand that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is the one nobody sees coming. The presentation continued for another hour, systematically dismantling every assumption about military superiority that the audience had held. By the end, the 1,000 elite warriors in the room sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that everything they thought they knew about their profession was being challenged. Then, unexpectedly, the lights dimmed further and a figure walked onto the stage. It was Rachel Porter, wearing a dress uniform that none of them had seen before. The Ghost 7 insignia was clearly visible now, a black emblem that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The auditorium erupted. 1,000 warriors rose to their feet as one, not ordered but compelled by recognition of something greater than rank or tradition. The applause was thunderous, continuing for a full minute before Rachel raised a hand for silence. 3 days ago, she said, her voice carrying easily through the space despite its softness, I was forced to reveal myself because of behavior that dishonored the uniform we all wear. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about the future. She paused, scanning the faces before her. Every person in this room has potential beyond what traditional metrics can measure. Every person who serves brings capabilities that could be the difference between mission success and failure. Our job, our duty, is to recognize and nurture all of that potential, not just the parts that fit our preconceptions. She looked directly at where Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes sat in the front row. These 3 men have volunteered to be part of the solution. They've acknowledged their failures and committed to change. That takes a courage different from what we usually celebrate, but no less important. Crawford stood up, his movement drawing every eye in the auditorium. Commander Porter, he said, his voice cracking slightly, I need to say this publicly. You saved my life in Fallujah. You saved 24 of us, and I repaid that by assaulting and humiliating you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Rachel studied him for a long moment. Chief Crawford, forgiveness isn't mine to give. It belongs to every woman who's been dismissed, every operator who's been overlooked because they didn't fit the mold, every warrior who's been told they're not enough because of how they look. But redemption? That's available to anyone willing to do the work. She turned back to the wider audience. Starting next month, we're implementing new selection criteria for special operations. We're not lowering standards, we're expanding them. We're looking for intelligence as well as strength, adaptability as well as aggression, the ability to become invisible as well as the ability to dominate. We're going to build a force that can win the wars of the future, not just the wars of the past. The presentation she gave outlined a complete restructuring of how America would select and train its elite warriors. Physical standards would remain high, but would be tailored to mission requirements rather than arbitrary benchmarks. Intelligence and language skills would be weighted equally with combat capabilities. And most importantly, the ability to operate in denied areas, to become invisible, to be underestimated, would become core competencies. Some of you will resist this change, Rachel said bluntly. Some of you will leave rather than accept that the traditional model is evolving. That's your choice. But those who stay, those who embrace this evolution, will become part of something unprecedented, a force that can operate anywhere, against any enemy, using advantages they'll never see coming. As she spoke, Crawford felt something shifting inside him. The worldview that had defined his entire military career was crumbling, but something else was taking its place. An understanding that strength came in many forms, that the most dangerous warrior might be the one you'd never suspect. The meeting concluded with an announcement that shocked everyone. Rachel Porter was being promoted to full colonel and given command of a new Joint Special Operations Unit that would incorporate the lessons learned from Ghost 7. The unit would recruit from all branches, all backgrounds, looking for operators who possessed unique capabilities regardless of their physical appearance. We're calling it Project Phoenix, General Williams announced. From the ashes of our old assumptions, we're building something new, something better, something that will keep America safe in a world where traditional warfare is becoming obsolete. As the crowd dispersed, Crawford approached Rachel one more time. This time, he didn't try to shake her hand or offer his challenge coin. He simply stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute. "Colonel Porter," he said formally, "I request permission to apply for Project Phoenix when my suspension is lifted." Rachel returned the salute. "Your application will be considered on its merits, Chief, like everyone else's. No assumptions, no prejudices, just capability." 6 months later, the Officers Club at Fort Bragg had been transformed. Where once it had been a bastion of traditional military culture, it now hosted regular briefings on unconscious bias, expanding capability assessment, and the importance of diversity in operational planning. The spot where Rachel had been confronted had been marked with a small plaque that read simply, "Strength comes in unexpected forms." Crawford, his suspension lifted after completing intensive remedial training, sat at the bar nursing a coffee. His challenge coin sat on the bar in front of him, but now it was accompanied by something else. A small black coin with the Ghost 7 emblem, given to him by Rachel Porter herself, after he had completed the first phase of Project Phoenix selection. He hadn't made it through the entire selection process, few did, but he'd learned more about himself and his limitations in those weeks than in his entire previous career. He'd discovered that the physical strength he'd always relied on meant nothing when the mission required becoming invisible. That his size, which he'd always seen as an advantage, was often a liability in modern warfare. Anderson, returned from his year of teaching humility to recruits, had revolutionized Ranger training. He'd introduced scenarios that couldn't be solved with firepower, that required creative thinking and cultural awareness. His students might have been smaller and less physically imposing than previous classes, but their success rate on complex missions had increased by 40%. Hayes had found his calling in intelligence analysis, identifying potential Ghost Unit candidates from personnel files that others had overlooked. His work had uncovered a former gymnast whose small size and flexibility allowed her to infiltrate spaces others couldn't reach, a poker player whose ability to read people had made him invaluable in interrogation resistance training, and a stage magician whose understanding of misdirection had revolutionary applications in tactical deception. If this story gave you chills, wait until you see what we have coming next. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because tomorrow's story involves a female Apache pilot who made an entire battalion salute. You won't want to miss it. But the biggest change was in the culture itself. The toxic masculinity that had once defined special operations was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something more inclusive but no less elite. Standards remained high, perhaps even higher, but they now measured capability rather than conformity. The phone in Rachel's office rang at 0200 hours on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. She was at her desk, reviewing applications for Project Phoenix, when the encrypted line engaged. The caller ID showed only Priority Alpha, authentication required. She provided her biometric authentication and heard the Secretary of Defense's voice. "Colonel Porter, we have a situation requiring Ghost 7's immediate attention." "I'm listening, sir." "Phoenix protocol has been activated. It's about Cairo." Rachel's entire body went still. Cairo had been a disaster 3 years ago, an operation where an entire CIA station had supposedly been eliminated, but Ghost 7 had always suspected there was more to the story. "The station chief and 12 operatives we thought were dead have been held captive for 3 years, the secretary continued. "We've just received proof of life and a ransom demand. But, Colonel, they don't want money." "What do they want?" "They want you, by name. They know about Ghost 7, and they specifically demand that you personally lead the exchange." The implications were staggering. Someone had connected the dots between the Officers Club incident and Ghost 7. The security breach Crawford had created had spread further than anyone realized. "There's more," the secretary added. The demand came with photos from inside the Officers Club. Someone was documenting the entire incident. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking at when your identity was revealed. Rachel's mind raced through possibilities. Someone at Fort Bragg had been a foreign agent, had witnessed her revelation, and had transmitted that information to enemies who could use it. The confrontation hadn't just compromised her, it had compromised ongoing operations and put American lives at risk. "I need Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes," she said suddenly. "If someone at Bragg is a foreign agent, they're the only ones I can trust." They were too genuinely shocked, by my identity to be plants. Colonel, those 3 men compromised you in the first place. Yes, sir, but that makes them the only ones I can be certain aren't enemy agents. Their reaction was too real, too emotional to be acting, and sir, they owe me. They'll do whatever it takes to make this right. There was a pause on the line. Very well. They're temporarily reinstated under your command. Colonel, the Cairo survivors have 72 hours. After that, understood, sir. Ghost 7 sempre pronto. Within an hour, Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes were standing in Rachel's office, having been pulled from their beds by military police who offered no explanation beyond, "Colonel Porter needs you." Rachel looked at the 3 men who had once mocked her for being weak. "Gentlemen, the security breach you created has been exploited by enemy agents. American lives are at risk because someone at Fort Bragg transmitted my identity to hostile forces. You're going to help me fix this." Crawford straightened, his bearing perfect. "Whatever you need, Colonel, we're ready." "No," Rachel said sharply. "You're not ready. You're not even close to ready. But you're going to have to become ready in the next 48 hours, because in 72 hours, we're going to Cairo to rescue 13 Americans who are being held because someone revealed that Ghost 7 exists." She stood, moving to a wall map marked with locations most of them couldn't identify. "The enemy knows I'm coming. They're expecting a traditional special operations rescue. What they're not expecting is for Ghost 7 to do what we do best: become invisible, be underestimated, and strike from directions they never imagined." She turned back to face them. "You 3 are going to be my visible team, the distraction. While they're focused on the big, obvious American operators they expect, my real team will be doing what ghosts do. But for that to work, you need to be convincing. You need to be everything the enemy expects American special operations to be." Anderson found his voice. "Colonel, we'll do whatever it takes. Those Americans in Cairo, they're counting on us. On you." "No," Rachel corrected. "They're counting on us becoming something more than we've ever been. Crawford, your arrogance is going to become an asset. I need you to be so obviously a SEAL that the enemy can't imagine you're a distraction. Anderson, your physical presence is going to draw fire while my people work. Hayes, your intelligence background means you'll be coordinating the deception." She moved to her desk, pulling out folders marked with classification levels that made the 3 men's eyes widen. "Welcome to Ghost 7, gentlemen. For the next 72 hours, you're going to learn what it really means to be invisible. You're going to understand why being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage. And you're going to help me save those Americans, not with strength or firepower, but with misdirection and deception." The mission briefing that followed shattered every conception they had about special operations. Rachel's plan didn't involve helicopters and explosions. It involved 3 female operators who could pass for local civilians, 2 men small enough to fit through ventilation systems that weren't supposed to be accessible, and a cyber warfare specialist who'd been recruited from federal prison where she'd been serving time for hacking the Pentagon. "Your job," Rachel told Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes, "is to be exactly what you've always been. Obvious, American, dangerous looking. You're going to walk in the front door while we come through the walls they don't even know exist." Over the next 2 days, the 3 men received a crash course in Ghost 7 tactics. They learned that sometimes the best camouflage was to be exactly what the enemy expected to see. That strength could be a liability when subtlety was required. That the most powerful position in any engagement was the one nobody knew you occupied. Crawford, struggling through an exercise that required him to remain motionless and unnoticed in a crowded room, finally understood something fundamental. "We've been fighting the last war," he said to Rachel during a break. "We've been training to be hammers when modern warfare requires scalpels." "No," Rachel corrected. "Modern warfare requires both, but we've only been training hammers. Ghost 7 provides the scalpels. Project Phoenix will provide both." 70 hours after the phone call, a C-130 transport flew through Egyptian airspace carrying what appeared to be a standard special operations team. Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes were visible in full tactical gear, their presence deliberately obvious to anyone monitoring American military movements. What the observers didn't see were the 6 Ghost 7 operators hidden in compartments that didn't appear on any schematic. They didn't see the 2 operators who had been inserted into Cairo 48 hours earlier, posing as humanitarian workers. They didn't see the cyber specialist who had been systematically destroying the enemy's electronic infrastructure for the past day. The rescue itself took exactly 43 minutes. Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes breached the front of the compound where the CIA personnel were being held, drawing every defender to their position. The enemy fought fiercely, exactly as expected, concentrating their forces against the obvious American threat. They never saw the Ghost 7 operators who came through the sewers, who had been living in the drainage systems for 2 days. They didn't notice the 2 who rappelled down elevator shafts that building plans said didn't exist. They were too focused on Crawford's massive frame and thunderous weapon to realize that the real threat was the 5'2" woman who looked like a local civilian and who eliminated 6 guards with a suppressed weapon they never saw coming. By the time the enemy realized they'd been deceived, 13 American CIA personnel were already being extracted through routes that had been invisible until Ghost 7 made them viable. The compound's defenders found themselves fighting shadows, engaging threats that appeared and disappeared like smoke. In the aftermath, Crawford stood in the destroyed compound, looking at the precision with which Ghost 7 had operated. No unnecessary casualties, no collateral damage, just surgical precision that had saved 13 American lives. "This is the future," he said to Anderson and Hayes. "This is what warfare is becoming." Rachel appeared beside them, having shed her local disguise for standard tactical gear. "No, Chief. This is what warfare has always been for those of us who couldn't rely on size and strength. We just figured out how to turn our limitations into advantages." The flight back to friendly territory was quiet, the rescued CIA personnel too exhausted and traumatized for conversation. But one of them, the station chief who had been held for 3 years, approached Rachel privately. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Ghost 7, you're the reason I stayed sane in there. Knowing that operators like you existed, that America had warriors the enemy couldn't even imagine, that kept me going." Rachel simply nodded, but Crawford overheard and felt something shift inside him again. The woman he'd mocked for being weak had been the hope that kept American prisoners alive in the darkness. Back at Fort Bragg, the successful rescue made headlines, though the details remained classified. What the public saw was a successful special operations mission. What they didn't see was how fundamentally it had changed the 3 men who'd participated. Crawford returned to his team not with his usual bravado, but with a quiet confidence that came from understanding his place in a larger picture. He became known for mentoring younger operators, especially those who didn't fit the traditional mold. His office wall featured the piece of Rachel's torn uniform, framed alongside a simple quote, "Strength has many faces." Anderson revolutionized Ranger training further, introducing Ghost 7 tactics that emphasized infiltration over assault. His students learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was not be seen at all. That being underestimated was a tactical advantage that, once lost, could never be recovered. Hayes became the intelligence community's primary recruiter for Project Phoenix, identifying candidates who possessed unique capabilities that traditional assessment had missed. He found strength in unexpected places. A ballet dancer whose understanding of movement and balance made her lethal in close combat. A con artist whose ability to become anyone made him invaluable for infiltration. A homeless veteran whose experience being invisible to society translated into tactical invisibility. 6 months after Cairo, Rachel stood before Congress in a closed session, testifying about the future of American special operations. The representatives, many of whom had served in traditional military roles, struggled to understand what she was proposing. "You're suggesting we recruit people who can't meet basic physical standards?" one congressman asked skeptically. "I'm suggesting we expand our definition of what constitutes strength," Rachel replied calmly. "A 5'2" woman who speaks 7 languages and can infiltrate any facility is more valuable for certain missions than a 6'4" man who can bench press 400 pounds but can't blend into a crowd." "But won't this weaken our military?" another representative pressed. Rachel pulled up a classified presentation on the secure display. In the past 6 months, Project Phoenix operators have completed 43 missions with a 100% success rate. Traditional special operations units attempting similar missions have a 67% success rate. We're not weakening our military, we're evolving it. The statistics were undeniable. Missions that would have required full military intervention were being completed by operators nobody saw coming. Threats were being eliminated before they materialized. Intelligence was being gathered from sources that traditional operators could never access. The world has changed, Rachel continued. Our enemies have adapted. They've learned our patterns, our tactics, our limitations. The only way to maintain superiority is to become something they don't expect, to be strong in ways they can't predict, to win battles before they know we're fighting. By the session's end, Project Phoenix had received full funding and authorization to expand. Ghost units would be established across all military branches, recruiting operators who possessed unique capabilities regardless of their physical appearance. The transformation of American Special Operations had begun in an officers' club with mockery and humiliation. It was culminating in a fundamental evolution of how America projected power in an increasingly complex world. A year after the confrontation at Fort Bragg, the Officers Club held a ceremony that wasn't on any official calendar. Rachel Porter, now Brigadier General Porter, returned to the place where her identity had been revealed. The club was packed with operators from every branch, every unit, every background. Crawford, Anderson, and Hayes stood in the front row, their Ghost 7 badges barely visible on their uniforms. They had eventually made it through the selection, not by becoming something they weren't, but by understanding how their traditional capabilities could support unconventional operations. 1 year ago, General Porter began, in this room, we learned that strength comes in many forms, that the most dangerous warrior might be the one you least expect, that being underestimated is not a weakness, but a weapon. She looked at Crawford directly. Chief Crawford asked me once if I'd ever been in combat. The truth is, I've never not been in combat. Every day, in every interaction, those of us who don't fit the traditional mold have had to fight to prove our worth. Today, that fight takes a new form. She gestured to the audience, which included operators of every size, gender, and background. Look around you. This is the future of American Special Operations. Not replacing traditional warriors, but expanding our definition of what a warrior can be. Together, we are stronger than any enemy can imagine. The ceremony concluded with something unprecedented. Crawford stepped forward and removed his seal trident, the badge that had defined his identity for 8 years. He handed it to Rachel with both hands, a gesture of profound respect. "General Porter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "this represents everything I thought I was, everything I thought mattered. You taught me that there's something beyond this, something more important than individual glory or unit pride. You taught me that true strength is in lifting others up, not putting them down." Rachel accepted the trident, then did something unexpected. She pinned it back on Crawford's uniform, right next to his Ghost 7 badge. "Wear both, Chief. Be both. That's what America needs." As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Rachel stood where the confrontation had occurred a year earlier. The coffee pot was still there, recently polished to a shine. She picked it up, hefting its familiar weight, and smiled. "Sometimes," she said to no one in particular, "the most powerful thing you can do is serve coffee while being capable of so much more." Crawford, standing nearby, nodded. "And sometimes the most important lesson you can learn is that the person serving you coffee might be the one who saves your life." The phone in Rachel's pocket buzzed with an encrypted message. Another mission, another threat to American security that required Ghost 7's unique capabilities. She looked at the message, then at the 3 men who had become some of her most trusted operators. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice shifting to command mode, "we have work to do." As they left the Officers Club together, Crawford couldn't help but reflect on the journey from mockery to respect, from ignorance to understanding, from traditional to transformational. The woman he had physically assaulted was now his commanding officer, and he couldn't imagine anyone he'd rather follow into combat. The story of the confrontation at Fort Bragg had become legend, told in every military institution as a cautionary tale about assumptions and prejudice. But for those who had lived it, it was more than a story. It was a transformation that had reshaped not just their careers, but their understanding of what it meant to be strong. As the SUV carrying them to their next mission disappeared into the night, the Officers Club returned to its normal evening routine. But nothing was really normal anymore. Everything had changed. The definition of warrior had expanded. The future of American Special Operations had been rewritten. And it had all started with a small woman serving coffee who turned out to be anything but weak. The revelation at Fort Bragg had ended, but its impact would ripple through military culture for generations. In conference rooms and training facilities, in selection courses and operational planning sessions, the lesson would be remembered. Never underestimate anyone, because the most powerful warriors are often the ones you never see coming. And somewhere in the shadows, invisible and underestimated, Ghost 7 continued their work, saving lives, eliminating threats, protecting America from dangers that would never make headlines. They were the warriors nobody expected, fighting battles nobody knew about, winning wars that were never declared. The phone call that had summoned Rachel away from that first confrontation had been just the beginning. Phoenix Protocol, Cairo, Project Phoenix. They were all pieces of a larger transformation. America was evolving its approach to warfare, and at the center of that evolution was a 5'5" woman who had been mocked for serving coffee, but who had proven that true strength had nothing to do with size. As dawn broke over Fort Bragg, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the base began another day of training and preparation. But now that training included lessons in humility, respect, and the recognition that every person in uniform brought unique capabilities that could be the difference between victory and defeat. The 3 brigadier generals who had saluted Rachel Porter that day had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. They had publicly acknowledged that rank and respect weren't determined by physical appearance, but by capability and sacrifice. Their salute had been more than a gesture. It had been a declaration that the military was ready to evolve. And evolution, as Darwin had observed, favored not the strongest but the most adaptable. In Rachel Porter and Ghost 7, America had found its adaptation to a changing world. In the confrontation at Fort Bragg, it had found the catalyst for transformation. The story would be told and retold, each version adding new details, new lessons, new understanding. But at its core, it would always be about the danger of assumptions, the power of being underestimated, and the revelation that true strength comes in forms we don't expect. Crawford kept his promise to tell the story wherever he went, not the classified details, but the lesson. He spoke at military academies, training facilities, and selection courses. His message was simple but profound. The person you dismiss today might be the one who saves you tomorrow. The warrior you don't recognize might be the most dangerous person in the room, and the strength you can't see might be the most powerful force on the battlefield. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Somewhere, in places America's enemies thought were secure, Ghost 7 operators were infiltrating, observing, and eliminating threats. They were the invisible warriors, the unexpected heroes, the proof that strength had many faces. And it had all started with a simple question: what's your rank? The answer had changed everything.